Welcome to CMMC Unacknowledged, where we ask our resident expert some of the unanswered questions that were asked during last month's CMMC-AB Townhall meeting. My name is Todd Stanton. I'm the Regional Sales Manager for all things CMMC at Etactics. And I'm joined by the Senior Information Assurance Manager at Rain Associates, Ty Wittenberg. Welcome, Ty.
Hey, Todd, thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So here's our question for this episode. In the CMMC Level 2 Scoping Guide, Table 1 provides 5 categories of CMMC assets. Can you provide us with just a high-level overview of these categories and then tell us which would be subject to the assessment using all 110 controls from NIST 800-171?
Yeah, for sure. So first off, I would start off by saying that assessment guide, the Undersecretary of Defense and their team did a nice job adding some additional clarities to the guides that weren't there in previous guides as folks were looking at this from the journey from CMMC 1.0 to now CMMC 2.0. But there's, like you said, there are 5 categories. There is CUI assets. There's security protection assets, contractor risk managed assets, and then specialized assets, as well as out of scope assets. So CUI assets, really speak to the systems that touch the critical information or the controlled and classified information. And it's critical in this particular case, I think, to know as an organization how your data flows, where it's mapped in your organization, along with any technical controls and safeguards that you have in place to protect that data. Your security protection assets would be those that are focused on avoidance controls and deterrent controls that really function to protect the information systems. I believe some good examples for that would be for our audience would be those folks that have firewalls and the firewall filter rules that you have in any type of physical barriers like locks to your server cabinets, your server rooms. A real easy thing would be also role-based access controls. And then from like a deterrent aspect, asset hardening or enforcement protocols, if you were to have something in the way of like a data loss protection or a cloud access security broker software. The next one up for us is contractor risk managed assets. The CRMA speaks to the overall network architecture, is my belief, and those organizations or those doing business in the defense industrial base, those organizations' overall controls, really take a look at it, the whole aspect of controls that you would put in place to safeguard a network. And that would be focused around avoidance, like I shared with you earlier, that would be like firewalls, firewall filters, or role-based access controls. Then you take a look at deterrent controls, which would be, your policies, logging and monitoring, enforcement protocols, or asset hardening, and then vulnerability, which would be scanning, your environment for OS patches and updates, but more along the line of like authorization, access privileges, patch management, and then your responsive controls that would be focused around making sure that you have good backups, and that there's, if there's an incident like the DFARS talked about, that you have good incident response and forensic processes in place. The next thing up for us would be, specialized assets. Once again, I think that really just kind of speaks holistically to the overall controls or network architecture, if I'm being very honest with you. Those specialized assets may or may not, process CUI or store or transmit it for that matter. But it could include property that the government provides to you. It could also be restricted information systems or test equipment. And that really just speaks to network architecture, segmentation, things like that, to make sure that you have good granular controls in place to manage those systems. And then the last thing would be out of scope assets. And those are assets that cannot process, store, or transmit CUI. You think about your production floor where you're programming a machine to do a specific function for a specific job. You might have to take that information over with a USB drive to load it in for it to do its job. But it is not the storage vessel for the controlled and classified information. That's all maintained on a USB drive. So those having such a brain cramp here. Help me out, Todd. Those CNC machines. There we go. Some of those would not store critical information, and depending on the age of your environment, they are a part of the process, but they are out of scope as far as assets are concerned.
So of these 5 categories, which ones would be within the full-blown 110 controls that would be assessed?
So clearly you're going to be looking at anything that houses, transmits, or processes CUI. So that's one of the first things I always like to do with a client is identify scoping. What does that workflow look like? How does it come from being a request for proposal to a one proposal to information flowing between the customer and the client? Once we identify that and maybe dive a little bit deeper in data mapping and identify how that CUI flows through the environment, it really helps us to identify scope. To answer your question, the CUI is the key part of it. The segmentation, the entire network architecture is the other. So, that really speaks to the security protection assets, what they have in place as far as things to protect their environment around firewalls, antivirus, things like that. I would just say that understanding how the data flows, understanding how policies or filters have been put in place for firewalls, those are all part of discussions and also interrogating and testing based off of what the client has in place.
And then my last question would be for the contractor risk managed assets and specialized assets. What does an organization seeking certification need to do to be compliant with the requirements for those categories?
So, I think having a good system security plan, written information security plan, while not necessarily mandatory for this level 2, is always a good place to start because it would speak to your role-based access policies, authorization and controls. If you're a more mature organization, even though it's not a requirement, but if you have some network segmentation, those all speak to security maturation that, even though these are all on the same system, may not provide as much of potential for action for a threat actor and reduce your threat vulnerability there.
And then as far as the out of scope assets, do we need to maintain an inventory of those, or if it's out of scope, then it does not need to be inventoried?
So it's out of scope, right? So I would be a hypocrite to say that you shouldn't have a good inventory for it. I believe you should, but it's not relevant or germane to the assessment process.
Okay, perfect. So the assets under 110 practices would be the CUI assets and security protection assets. The other 2 categories, the contractor risk managed and specialized assets, we need to have listed in the SSP, we need to have listed in the inventory. But if it's outside of the scope, it's not connected to CUI assets, then we don't need to inventory it. But your advice, best practices would be to maintain a working inventory, correct?
A good working inventory is like the foundation. Asset management always seems to be the Achilles for any organization, whether it be small or large. So those smaller organizations in the defense industrial base don't need to feel embarrassed if they haven't been good about asset management, because the reality is it becomes a challenge no matter the complexity, whether you're small or large. So if you can get a hold of your assets and have a life cycle around managing that, you're in a much better place than any of your peers.
All right. Well, I think that concludes the questions on table 1. So thank you for your breakdown and for your input on that.
Yeah, you're welcome.